Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. City Club is where we bring civic-minded people together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Karen Curvin, president of City Club. I would like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at Sentinel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partner, Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, Family Care Health Plans, Legacy Health, Russell Fellow Properties, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. We are pleased to welcome back Civic Scholars from Madison High School. Civic Scholars is our initiative to expand opportunities for high school students to more deeply engage in Portland's civic issues, bringing civic education out of the classroom and into the community. This morning, prior to the forum, they had their own Q&A with today's speakers. Students, please stand if you are able, and welcome to Friday Forum. At next week's Friday Forum, we will discuss whether colleges are doing enough to combat sexual assault on campus. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. After our program, Ryan White will facilitate a question and answer session with our other panelists. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. For all of our audience members, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. Hold your cards high and City Club staff will collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now for our program. It's 10 weeks after the University of Oregon's quest for the College Football Championship, and March Madness is here in Portland with NC2A men's basketball tournament games at Moda Center. They are undeniably exciting, but do big-time sports and the time and money invested in them really pay off for our students and improve the reputation of our colleges? Dr. William Harbaugh blogs on UO Matters, the unofficial organ of the University of Oregon, where he is a popular and widely published professor of economics and a critic of what he sees as an overemphasis on athletics. Jordan Kent, the University of Oregon's first three-sport athlete and a former pro football player, is a Comcast Sportsnet Northwest analyst and founder of a camp for boys and girls that stresses character as well as sports skill. Dr. Michael Oriard, who played at Notre Dame and for the Kansas City Chiefs and spent 37 years at Oregon State University, where he was Distinguished Professor of American Literature and Culture and Associate Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, is the author of End of Autumn, a football memoir. Our moderator is Ryan White. He's covered sports, music, and culture for the Oregonian for 16 years and was twice named one of the top writers in the country by the Society for Features Journalism. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Thank you all for being here. I was at the Moda Center for about 13 hours yesterday, covering games for the Wall Street Journal. And late in the evening, after the last game, I was walking down a hallway, and Georgetown's mascot walked by me, raised a hand for a high five. I generally take the position of not encouraging mascots ever and under any circumstances. But it was late, I was tired, so I reached up, gave him a high five, and his hand was cold and wet and sweaty and just gross. And I thought that was a pretty good, a pretty good kind of metaphor for what we're talking about today. College sports is exciting and cuddly and fun until you get up close to it and actually touch it. And then it becomes a bit of a problem. So before we get to our fantastic panelists here, I wanted to set the stage with some numbers. The NCAA, which is bringing you all of this March Madness, recently reported their fiscal year 2014, $989 million in revenue. About $700 million of that comes directly from a 14-year deal with CBS and Turner, which totals out around $11 billion for the life of that contract. So they took that $989 million and turned it into an $80 million surplus last year, and that's the fourth straight year that the NCAA has had a surplus greater than $60 million. Locally, if you go back 20 years to 1995, Oregon was coming off his first Rose Bowl appearance since 1958. Mike Bellotti was going into his first year as a head coach. The athletic department at Oregon had an $18 million budget, and of that, football spent $6.25 million. 8 years later, they've won a Fiesta Bowl. Joey Harrington is a Heisman finalist. $34 million for the athletic department, $10.9 million for football. Fiscal year 2014, the Ducks spent $29.2 million on football, with athletic department expenses listed at over $110 million, which they could do because the revenue totaled $196 million, which is slightly deceiving because that includes a one-time non-cash gift from FIT LLC. FIT, which is spelled with a PH, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Oregon Foundation, but it's Phil Knight. And that donation was a building, the Hatfield-Dowling Complex, and valued at $95,019,651. And if you don't know the Hatfield-Dowling Complex, one, you probably never will because it's hard to get into. But it is 145,000 square feet of a very fine line between football ops and black ops. The seats in the meeting rooms are wrapped in the same Italian leather that Ferrari uses. There's a sound system that was developed in Finland. There is Brazilian hardwood in the weight room. The players' lounge features a hand-woven Nepalese rug, and the urinals were imported from Turkey. Michael, you played football at Notre Dame in the 60s for one of the sport's premier coaches. And you've written a lot about the evolution of college sports. Talk a little bit about your experience and then kind of help us figure out how we got from your experience to Turkish urinals.
Okay. I was an English professor who reinvented himself as a cultural historian of football. And so, as Ryan said, I've written a lot about the history of football. My own experience in the late 60s as a college student, I would sum up as I got the best education my institution offered, and I had to make no academic sacrifices in order to play big-time college football. And I don't believe that that is even possible today. I think sacrifices have to be made even for the most motivated students. But Jordan will be able to speak more directly to that because he's a more recent graduate. Now, how we got from there to here, and the here I take to be roughly this, that what the NC2A persists in calling student athletes are not served particularly well either as students or as athletes. It's part of There was never a golden age in college sports. From the very beginning, there was struggle with contradiction between an extracurricular activity that was also a popular entertainment. But it's played out over a long period of time, and in recent years, which I would call the last couple of decades, it seems to me at some point we passed a tipping point beyond which the disparities that were always sort of there have become so pronounced that we can't ignore them anymore. So how we got there, the steps that got us to where we are today, the key steps I would identify is it starts in 1956. Modern college athletics starts in 1956 with the institutionalization of the athletic scholarship. Before that time, it was considered unethical, not appropriate to provide financial support for athletics as opposed to academic or financial need. And any kind of financial support of athletes was called professionalism. In 1956, with the institution and acceptance of the college athletic scholarship, Professionalism was redefined as amateurism, but now allowed tuition, board, and room. Nobody, of course, anticipated everything that would happen. They did anticipate there'd be a problem that these guys would look like employees now. So Walter Byers, the head of the NC2A, coined the term student athlete so that they could legally defend themselves against workman's compensation claims and that sort of thing. So an athletic scholarship was 4 years, and over the course of the 60s, you know, some players quit but kept their scholarships. It was frustrating for coaches. 1972-73 is the next key period. 1972, freshmen were made eligible for varsity competition. When I was at Notre Dame, we were not. We had a 3-game season. Then in 1973, the 4-year scholarship became a 1-year scholarship, renewable at the coach's discretion, and that made athletes basically beholding to their coach, not to their professors for their continuing at the university. Nobody anticipated then what was going to happen, because then what happened in the 1980s, well, first ESPN happened and changed the sports landscape. But in 1984, a lawsuit brought by the football, strong football programs succeeded the Supreme Court, and the NC2A lost the right to negotiate TV rights for member institutions in football. Initially, revenues plummeted because the game of the week became dozens of games a week, and you know the rights were much lower. But over time they recovered, and in the meantime there started becoming a restructuring of conferences, because conferences now negotiated contracts, and that's where the money was. So in the 1990s, and it began with Notre Dame when it signed its own TV contract in 1990, and in the same year that Penn State joined the Big Ten, there started to be this realignment. The Big East was created, you know, with no football schools in it, but it had all those TV markets, and so the revenue starts becoming increasingly valuable and attractive, and conferences start realigning to excuse me, to get their piece of it. 1995, Bobby Bowden becomes the first $1 million coach. 2 years later, Steve Spurrier becomes the first $2 million coach, and then it just keeps going and going and going. At the same time, in 1973, when they created the 1-year scholarship, they got rid of, they basically made eligibility requirement only a high school diploma with a 2.0 grade point average. So now you have kids coming into school ill-prepared, and they are beholden to the coach for their success, for their continuing at the university. So what you have in the 80s and 90s, as the revenue's going up, we have one academic scandal after another. And we have the NC2A trying to deal with these through Proposition 48, 42, 16, and so on up to the NPR, the APR more recently. So what happens is then it just keeps accelerating. And most recently, you know, we have these astonishing TV contracts with the major conferences that, say for a school like Oregon State, where we used to get about $6 million in conference payouts each year, very soon it's going to be $20 million. And being in one of those 5 conferences that gets the $20 million payouts as opposed to not is creating this really weird, I mean, we've always had haves and have-nots, but the disparity is just enormous now. And along the lines, the question is, well, and how are the athletes doing on all of this? You know, when the graduation rates are being published, even the APR has a target of 60% graduation rate. That means 40% not graduating is the goal, you know, and so legislators start paying attention to this, and athletes' rights people start paying attention to this, and lawyers start paying attention to this, and this O'Bannon case is going to transform the whole athletic experience. So it's a continuation of a system that has been struggling with this contradiction for a long, long, long time, but as I said at the outset, the disparities have just gotten enormous through events that people didn't anticipate and whose consequences they didn't foresee, but they've happened.
Jordan, I know you're you're sort of feigning not being as young as you are so far this morning, but you are the modern athlete in this room, and you were at Oregon. Talk about what your day-to-day experience was like, what your kind of week-to-week experience was like. You know, what was it like compared to friends who weren't athletes? Did you even have time to have friends who weren't athletes? Give us a little bit of insight into the modern college athletic.
Well, when I was at Oregon, playing football, basketball, and track, you were busy year-round. And you had mentioned sacrifices. And you only have 24 hours in a day, so something has to give. And for me, I understood that my priority as a student athlete was to, number one, get my degree, and then number two, become the best athlete I can. And so one thing I really had to sacrifice was the typical college social life, you could say. Whether it's throwing frisbee out in the quad for hours or having spring break vacations, those were events I chose to sacrifice because I knew through academics and through athletics I was setting myself up for the rest of my life, hopefully. And so a typical day, a lot of our classes would be in the morning, and we would have 8 a.m. classes, and it's dark in the winter term at 8 a.m., I'll tell you that much, so it's hard to get out of bed for that. But you go to class from about 8 to noon, you have time to grab a sandwich, and then during football season, you head on over to the football complex. It's filmed starting at 1 o'clock, practice is at 3, practice gets done at 5, you go to training table afterwards to get some dinner, and then you get home physically exhausted and mentally exhausted about 6:30, and then you do your homework and you have to study, and would leave about 45 minutes to an hour and a half, 2 hours some nights just to relax and unwind. And for me, typically, I would just play video games, or my roommate was a non-athlete as well, too. And one of the benefits about being in those locker rooms are there are a lot of great guys there, so you sort of have that camaraderie and that friendship and that social life there within the locker room itself, and you're sharing the experiences going on the road and traveling. But the biggest challenge was time management, and I think it was really difficult sometimes seeing students in college that seemed like they had all the time in the world, and it almost felt unfair at times when you have to get ready to prepare for a midterm or prepare for a final, and every little bit of time you have free is spent towards studying. But I look back at that and I don't regret it at all because, number one, my coaches for every sport were really disciplined about academics. I understand some of the statistics at various universities, but my time at Oregon for the football, basketball, and track team, we had really great academic student athletes on that team, and almost being surrounded by them helped encourage me to really pay attention to my education. And when I look back at my years at Oregon, again, sure, I didn't have as much time to have those spring break vacations and go down to Shasta and go back home and relax during winter break. You were either always training or playing catching up. But for me, it really set me up for the rest of my life as far as some of the things I wanted to do. And there's a saying, you just do the things you don't want to do now so you can do the things you want to do later when you want to do them. And that was my belief in college because I felt it was more than just my job to be an athlete. It was to be a student first and foremost.
Bill, you're on the academic side of things, the educational side of things. Do you know where the urinals in your office building were produced?
American Standard Flush Boys, yes.
How do these? I mean, obviously, these are some very different things. Athletics at the level that we're talking about it, and the institutional mission of a university. How do these pieces fit together from your point of view, from a faculty point of view?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting situation. I was talking with the civic scholars about this a little earlier, and I got to say that I agree with Jordan that that athletics can give students a lot of discipline that they don't necessarily get in high school and sometimes in college. Sometimes their teachers are pretty easy on students. It's hard to give your students a hard time and really force them to work hard. That takes a lot of energy. So I hear from high school students that their classes are just not that rigorous. And they're looking for something that is rigorous, something that is competitive, that they can really test themselves against. And for better or worse, the athletics is the most obvious thing that comes to mind in American society. So I think there are plenty of examples of students who get that character development out of athletics. Sometimes they succeed in transferring it over later in life to academics and to their life in general. So that's the good side of athletics for me. But that's not really what we're talking about here today. We're talking about big-time college sports and whether that's worth it. And the form that big-time college sports has taken is very different than just sort of the competitive engagements that you could have on a playing field without all the hoopla and TV and so forth. So the question is big-time college sports worth it? And I think the answer is it's obviously worth it. The question is, for whom is it worth it? And at the moment, it's an extremely lucrative business. As Ryan was saying, the budget for the athletic department at Oregon has tripled in about 10 years, much faster rate of increase than the budget for the academic side. The University of Oregon now spends about 12.5% of its entire budget just on athletics. So it's a lot of money, and when people find themselves making a lot of money at something, they work very hard to try to get more of that money. That's more of the competitive instinct that can drive people to do good things. The problem with big-time sports is we have not figured out how to harness that energy and make it do something that's good for the university as a whole. So I'm from the University of Oregon. We have, in the last 20 years, drastically expanded the sports enterprise. And it is very hard as a professor, I've been here for 20 years, to look around and see any way in which the athletic department's success has translated to a better university in general. Okay, it's been very good for some people. Coaches are making millions of dollars. Our athletic director just got a $400,000 raise. Very lucrative for them. But for the average student, not so much. One example would be that the student tuition of regular students is now used to subsidize a student-athlete tutoring center that the regular students are not allowed entry into. So this tutoring center costs about $4,000 a year per student-athlete. The university spends about $225 a year on comparable services for regular students. So there's, as I say, lots of money, but it's difficult to see how it's come back to help the rest of the university. When you look at some of the academic research and you ask, okay, does sports success translate into higher donations for the university? Yes. When football teams win, donations from alumni increase. Donations to the football team increase. Donations to the academic side actually go down. And that's a simple substitution effect. People, they're alumni, they see they can give to various causes. Well, they see the football team as a success, don't hear so much about the academic side, they shift their donations. So there are many ways in which not just that the athletic success has not been, good for the university, in some ways in which it's actually been harmful for the university. We just started a major branding campaign. You've all heard about the O. So when you think of the University of Oregon, you think of its athletic enterprise. Connie Ballmer, one of the members of our new board of trustees, has given the university $20 million for an academic branding campaign. Well, that's great, but in some ways, we need to spend that $20 million to overcome the fact that people's main thought when they think of the University of Oregon is the athletic program rather than the academic side of the university. So it's costly to us in that way also. Then the last thing I'll say is that it's very difficult to try to change big-time college sports. So much money is at stake. So many people are very deeply entrenched in it. The president of the NCAA is making somewhere between $2 and $4 million a year. We don't know. The president of the Pac-12 is making another $2-3 million a year. The coaches are making many, many millions of dollars. My distant cousin, Jim Harbaugh, is making $8 million a year. Good for him. When people have that much money at stake, it's really hard to get them to change. So we are trying to do that at the University of Oregon. The faculty is trying to do that. And one way that we're trying to do that is to tax the athletic department a little bit, just a little bit. And so we're proposing, we actually have some university legislation to have the athletic department pay 3% of its revenues to academic scholarships for good students, low-income students, that sort of thing. So we're trying to figure out a way to we know big-time sports is not going to go away. We're trying to figure out ways to make it help the rest of the university as well.
I think, it is, as we talk about, who is this good for? Who benefits it? A lot of it has to do with, and I think we're going to come back to this a lot, is what is the definition of amateurism? And the definition is changing. We've mentioned, everybody up here mentioned coaches' salaries. Nick Saban makes about $7 million a year at Alabama. In 2013, the Alabama version of the Oregon Foundation, out of the goodness of its heart, no contractual obligation whatsoever, just decided to pay off his $3.1 million house for him because they like him a lot. Were they to buy a football player dinner, it would be an NCAA violation. Michael mentioned the Ed O'Bannon case going on right now, which is essentially Ed O'Bannon was a UCLA star, realized one day that his likeness was used in these video games, EA Sports video games, and figured that it was every bit of his characteristic, his stats, is everything but his name. And so they are suing the NCAA for name, likeness, and image rights so that they can in some way profit from that. The appeal was heard by a panel in the Ninth Circuit on Tuesday down in San Francisco. Yesterday, Ed O'Bannon sent out a tweet about he was watching basketball and enjoying it. It was sponsored by Kingsford, the charcoal company. And to see the type of emotion that this stuff brings up, the very first reply to his Kingsford-sponsored tweet was, "Bro, everyone hates you because the NCAA doesn't make video games with EA anymore. Go away." And then they just got profane. So what are the options for players right now? There's court work being done. The lawyers are getting their billable hours, and this will go on for a while. What do we see as realistic options? I know, Jordan, you've got some real thoughts on some things that could be done.
Well, I think it's no surprise if you go to an Oregon football game at Autzen Stadium, you see a lot of number 8 jerseys. No name on the back, but number 8. Everybody knows whose jersey that is, Marcus Mariota. I believe that athletes nowadays, college athletes, because of the entertainment aspect of sports, it's the E and ESPN for crying out loud, are now household names. They are as prominent, if not more so prominent, than a lot of professional athletes. I think it's a very slippery slope if you get into paying particular athletes while they're competing and while they are in school. But at the same time, I think it's also very difficult to have this gray area where it says jersey number, but it's not really him. And a lot of these jerseys you're looking at cost $120. So if you're on these aren't people that are obviously concerned about being on a budget buying these jerseys for the most part. So one of the solutions we talked with Ryan is go ahead and put the name on the back of the jersey. Don't worry about trying to hide that fact. Raise the price by 10%, and then keep that royalty in a fund for whatever athlete that jersey's being sold after. If, and hopefully when he graduates, this is a source of income he can then tap into. If he chooses not to graduate, you now have a source of funds to go back into the general student fund right there. And I think you dodge the bullet as far as, is this his jersey? Or are you using my likeness? Did you give me permission? Go ahead and use it, but then make it very clear to the athlete that this is something when you graduate, because you have 2 jobs as a student athlete. Number 1 is to graduate. Number 2 is to give your very best as an athlete for this university.
The main thing I would say about this is that whatever is done is not going to be decided by university administrators. It's going to be decided by courts, and then university administrators are going to scramble to respond as best they can. And the original O'Bannon ruling said that athletes should be entitled to the full cost of attendance with their athletic scholarships. Okay, one of the kind of succinct ways of formulating the problem was that coaches' salaries had increased from $30,000 in 1970 to several $1 million in 2000 whatever, and players hadn't gotten a raise in that time. It's still tuition, board, and room. And then the concept of the full cost of tuition comes from financial aid offices at universities, where they calculate how much it actually costs to go to school beyond tuition, board, and room. And depending on the community, it's more expensive in LA or San Francisco than Corvallis to live. So the full cost of attendance at UCLA, at Berkeley, and at Oregon State will be somewhat different, but they will be somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000, somewhere around there. So the original O'Bannon ruling said that athletes are entitled to the full cost of attendance in their athletic scholarships if universities would choose to offer it. And then also proposed that, sort of along the lines of Jordan's suggestion, that for every year of eligibility you complete, you would get a $5,000 stipend put into a trust fund for after you graduate. And this is what's being contested now by the NC2A, and how that plays out is going to sort of shape what universities can do in the near future. In the meantime, the 5 major conferences, each with its own TV network or one of those tremendous TV contracts outside the conference, that provides about $20 million per institution per year, has been freed by the NC2A to legislate for themselves, and just in January decided to have 4-year scholarships and forbid universities to take away their scholarship, an athlete scholarship, for athletic reasons only. So guess what? That's unwinding what was done in 1972-73 after all of this controversy about the implications of that. Now, I don't think universities, those 5 conferences did it, simply out of the goodness of their hearts. I think they did it to be proactive, because if they fear anything more than lawsuits, they fear congressional involvement. And Congress has rumbled periodically, but is rumbling louder about this. So the universities, to be proactive, have decided to do that. Okay, so what that does is create a real gap between those 5 conferences that can afford to do that and the rest of the college athletic world that can't. And so how that plays out is going to be one thing. But what happens in the O'Bannon decision will have further implications. If that notion of a $5,000 stipend going to a trust fund is accepted, then amateurism just gets redefined once again to allow for $5,000 stipends that go to a trust fund. But then you've got these problems. Okay, if you do this for men's basketball and football that generate the revenue, what do you do about wrestling and gymnastics and swimming and golf? And what do you do about Title IX and who's entitled and all this sort of thing? The nightmare scenario is that, a quarterback's worth, $20,000 and a backup guard is worth, $3,000, and a swimmer's worth nothing. I mean, and that's not going to play, legally anywhere. So the courts and possibly Congress, though more likely the courts, is going to shape what becomes possible for the sports world, and then the rest of us academic institutions will respond, will respond as best we can.
So yeah, I can say something about this. We're talking about big-time college sports, but it's a very interesting economic situation, even if you're not an economist. What happens is that football brings in huge revenues to the university. So the University of Oregon sells about $20 million a year in football tickets. They get, I think, another $25 million in donations that essentially are also part of the price of the tickets. They've got a TV contract worth maybe $20, $25 million. It's pretty hard to get them to tell us exactly how much it is. Add it all up, and they're bringing in about $100 million in revenue. What do they do with that? Well, they don't give a dime of it to the academic side of the university. They manage to work their accounts out every year so that their expenses are basically $1 short of their revenue. And I imagine they sit around arguing about who's going to get that extra dollar at the end of the year. But where a lot of the money goes, I mean, we talk about the coaches, the NCAA bosses and stuff like that, but a huge amount of the money from football goes to subsidize other sports, not big-time sports, but sports like women's tennis, golf, so forth. These are sports that make no money. You want to watch one of these games, you just walk in, nobody's taking tickets. It's not on TV. The players in those sports, though, get an extremely good deal from the university. They also get the scholarship. Not clear whether they'll get cost of attendance or not, but they get all that. And in those sports, because there's not as much money involved, they don't face the same pressure to go to the weight room for 3 hours a day after they're done with practice and so forth. So they're able, the students in those sports are able to really get a good college experience at the same time that they're participating in a sport. They have well-paid coaches, training, all that kind of stuff. Who's paying for that is basically the football players under the current scheme. They're bringing in tons of revenue for the university. The coaches are taking their money, but the rest of it, a lot of it, is going to subsidize these other sports. Now, the part of this that seems strangest to me is that the football players, the basketball players earn a little bit of revenue for the university too, but those players tend to be from low-income families, right? Okay, and yet then when you look at the women's tennis players, the golf players, those are generally kids from very wealthy families on average. So we're taking money from the least advantaged people in society and using it to subsidize college educations for the most advantaged people in society. And that's just kind of one of the weird side effects of the way that the NCAA has tried to stay in business and preserve its monopoly over the years. So that, you know, it's another thing that really needs some reform in universities.
I think as the clock is ticking on us, maybe we should talk, you know, a little bit about how we can see the future. I'm kind of reminded every time of year this year, you know, Michael mentioned that the term student athlete was actually created by Walter Byers, the head of the NCAA, and you know, I'd kind of like to shake the hand of whoever came up with the phrase corporate champion for their NCAA tournament sponsors. That's a nice bit of speak there. Notre Dame's athletic director this week came out and basically said, you know, we are moving towards a two-tier system of Division I athletics. And he was talking to CBSSports.com's Dennis Dodd, and he said, forget the economics, the cultural divide in college athletics is getting too big. Any business association requires commonality of interests to hold together. The Oregon and Stanford economic models are similar. Their approach to sports couldn't be more different. Essentially saying that there will be, you know, a group of teams that are just going to go all in on sports, which would in some ways be the honest way of doing things. Do we see that as a more realistic future than reining things in and making them a little different? And maybe we'll just work down the panel here.
Yeah, I mean, something of that sort is going to happen because of what becomes permissible and affordable for some institutions will not be for others. This was really fascinating what this AD from Notre Dame did, because he actually put the institutions that would be in both sides of this. And on the semi-professional side, he had all of the major state universities, with the exception of Cal. And over on this side, you know, the kind of the non-professional side, he moved all of the elite private universities and Cal, and then they're with, you know, the regional universities, state universities. It's a strange company over there. But the idea was that these would opt to go for whatever payment of athletes is permissible, and these would not. Something of that sort is going to happen. Once these decisions are finalized, you know, the appeal to NC2A to the O'Bannon case is finalized and all that, then institutions are going to have to figure out what they can do and who they're going to do it with, who are going to be our peer institutions. Now, the one thing that we haven't talked about enough in all of this is we're talking about impact on institutions rather than on student athletes. And there's going to suddenly be opportunities not created, you know, in a boardroom by coming up with the best ideas, but you know, sort of dictated by a court decision that's going to force boardrooms to suddenly think about these things. And the side of the NC2A that decides not to go semi-professional and pay stipends or pay full cost of attendance or whatever it might be, what I would hope is possible, and you know, I'm too old to be highly optimistic about this, is that somebody sit down and you know, the NC2A today, in its defense, always says it's the student who matters most. They're students, they're not employees, they're students. Well, imagine what college sports would look like if you put the students' interests first, truly first, and then go from there. You know, I mean, it might be interesting. You know, people earlier in the day have mentioned the possibility of, you know, athletes not even taking classes during season because they're putting in 45 hours a week on their sports, you know, but you know, be able to take classes after their eligibility is done. I mean, you know, whatever it takes. You know, the amount of classroom time, you know, the Pac-12 network is great for $20 million a year, but guess what? There are athletic events every night of the week. Football, when I played, was Saturday afternoons only. Now football could be Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and guess what? You know, more class time missed and so on. So, I mean, decisions can be made that are not driven entirely by revenues, perhaps, you know, in an optimistic scenario here, that would not have been conceivable without, you know, somebody putting down the hammer in a courtroom and saying, okay, this is the new playing field.
I think when it comes to paying college athletes, it's something that should be avoided. I think there's a lot of benefits that athletes receive that aren't necessarily monetary. I look at the networking opportunity. As one of these athletes that has played football or basketball, the exposure you get, not only regionally but nationally, the platform that you have from that is something that I think a lot of traditional students would envy, to where when you get done with your career, you've got a sense of familiarity with people. You can go into a room and shake someone's hand and say, hey, I played football for so-and-so, and there's that instant connection right there. And I think some more education on the value of that is critical, because I look at some of the changes that have happened in the Pac-12 right now, where you do have a 4-year scholarship. All 3 meals per day are provided for the athletes. As a college athlete, it's a privilege to be able to be given some of the finest sporting equipment to work with, to train in first-class facilities, to travel around the country, to network with people that will help me build a career someday. And then on top of it, I get my school paid for, my housing paid for, and my meals paid for. I'm sorry, I might be in the minority when it comes to student athletes, but I don't think you can argue much more after that. It's your responsibility then to go to school and to hold yourself as a person that reflects the character of the university at that point. I think even if you have this divide, which we are already seeing with the major conference realignments that we've seen in the last couple of years, it's already happening. And the fact that there are only 110 Division I football teams as opposed to 313 in basketball shows you it's going to vary per sport. I think if you do have schools that go all in, let them go all in the way that they spend money on their athletes. But there's no way that you can pay athletes unless it's regulated, because it's just going to make recruiting a nightmare when you can say, if you go to Oregon, you're going to get this much per month, but if you come to Alabama, we can pay you X amount of more. There are a lot of 17 and 18-year-olds that will go strictly to where the money is, and I think that's when you throw all the amateurism out the window. So as I look at this, and as entertainment continues to build up sports, there's certainly going to be a lot more money in there, and people are going to be making a lot more money. And I think lately people are saying, woe is me to the athletes, but I think if you step back, and at least from my perspective, I feel like I got the whole world and then on top of it as an athlete, and I wasn't paid a dime for my performance. I got my college education, and I got to experience some wonderful things in my life that helped make me the man I am. And I think if you're a student athlete, that's all you can hope for going to school.
Jordan wins. Bill, closer, we got about 2 minutes in, and this is, way too big a question probably for 2 minutes, but Michael Weinreb, who's a buddy of mine, wrote a really great book this year called Seasons of Saturday, and he goes back all the way to, like, Walter Camp at the beginning of the late 19th, early 20th century. He was saying a lot of the same things that we were when the forward pass began to popularize the game from outside the elitist kind of enclave on the East Coast that it began in. And so these are not new questions, and the world keeps turning, and things just keep getting bigger, and we have these discussions all the time. But Michael asked a really good question early in that book. He said, once college football becomes an unapologetic business enterprise, what possible case can be made that it should be lashed to a college in the first place? From the college side of things.
Well, I think it would be good for everyone to separate college football from college, honestly, and I think that one way to do that would be for the University of Oregon, for example, to set up a separate nonprofit football, for the football team, and isolate itself as much as possible from what goes on there, because right now, my university is going to be on its 6th president in 6 years. We hope we can hire somebody in May. I've looked at the schedules of these guys. They're spending 50% of their time dealing with big-time sports, with the fallout from it, from badly behaved players or from boosters who are trying to manipulate them into spending money on this or that or the other thing. It is a complete distraction to the academic purpose of the university. I'm not doubting the argument that sports are good or can be good for people, but it's a huge distraction when you're trying to run a university. The other point I'd like to make is that you're an exception. I mean, this worked out fantastically well for you, and I admire you for it and everything. I mean, but you are not the average U of O football player. And when I look at what has happened with the academic success of those players. They are tracked by the athletic department into a series of gut courses. They're given very easy grades. There's one course called, if you Google it on your cell phone, FHS 199, where their academic assignment was to do a 2-minute video about themselves. They're hilarious videos. I highly recommend them. That got them 3 academic credits. It was taught by an athletic department employee for 6 years before the academic side was even able to find out about it. Many other examples of that, where we're supposed to be giving these students a good education as compensation for the massive amounts of money they bring in for the university. We're not able to do that. And it's not because the faculty doesn't try. It's because the athletic enterprise has much more money and much more power over what happens at the university than the faculty does at this point.
Go, real quick.
Well, I would certainly say that there are definitely examples where it could certainly be a lot better. At the same time, I was surprised when I joined the football team how many of these athletes did get their education. We're thankful for the networking. And for a lot of these students coming into school, they wouldn't go to college if it wasn't for football. And while there's certainly many improvements that need to be made when they're in school, I agree. I think the fact that they're getting exposed to some of that professional life when they normally wouldn't if they didn't play football and didn't have admission to school, a little bit's better than nothing. But I think once we get them there, I think there's a lot more education that needs to take place as far as preparing them to be a professional in life, and not in football, but a professional in life when you get done with school. And I think it takes a commitment not only from the athletic department, but from the coaching staff and from the university to get to that point.
All right, we are going to open up to the Q&A portion of the program. If you have written a question on an index card, please hold it up high so that the City Club staff can collect it from you. And we will take questions from the audience. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their questions. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to anyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less, and I will read from an index card or two eventually.
Muriel Lezak, City Club member. You've been talking about, or the question is our college athletics worth it? And of course, focusing on football, which is the big elephant in the room. My question is, what have you considered, have any of you considered the long-term costs to players, their families, and society, including taxpayers, of course, for the injuries incurred in practice and play, especially the costs of early dementia, which we know happens, and which is closely associated with repeated concussions, what many athletes will push off as dings because they want to keep playing. They're still too young.
I have thought a lot about this and written a lot about this, and yeah, this is, you know, all the problems that the NFL as well as college athletics have in high school sports and all of that. You know, this is the overriding issue that may mean the end of football, period, or may not. The thing, where we are right now, okay, so when I played, and even when Jordan played, yeah, even when Jordan played, I'm guessing, but definitely when I played, concussions were thought to be bruises to the brain, and so they healed like other bruises. And so even if you suffered a really full-blown concussion, not just got your bell rung or your head dinged or whatever, you know, all you had to do was sit out and let it heal, and then you're okay. When I played, the worst injury you could imagine was a spinal cord injury. That's why we build up our necks. And we all kind of expected to have joint problems if we played long enough. But when CTE, when the traces of chronic traumatic encephalopathy were found in Mike Webster's brain, I think the paper was published in like 2005, it just changed. You know, not only was your mobility at risk, but now your selfhood was at risk. The problem where we are today, and the problem is most acute for parents of grade school and high school kids, do I let my kid play tackle football? The problem is that we have increasing evidence that there are problems, but we don't have enough medical evidence yet of just how severe, how common. We don't know exactly which blows in which direction of which force, are the most dangerous and so on. Sensible people are beginning to say, don't let your kid play tackle football at least before the age of 12, if not 14, when the brain's developing and so on. But what about high school and college kids and so on? Yeah, I mean, we've got concussion monitoring protocols that are different. I mean, we're much more aware, we collectively, but unevenly, of course, I'm sure, are paying more attention to these things, pending that medical scientific research that clarifies these issues. But yes, absolutely, this is in fact the biggest, most fundamental issue out there, and football at all levels is at stake in that one.
Let's get another question.
Hi, I'm Cindy Gustav Squared Trong, and I'm from Civic Scholars of Madison High School. And to start my question, there have been multiple scandals at colleges where college professors would kind of like take a step down on their grading system for college athletes because they get special treatment. My question is, why do you believe that some college professors and classes seem to, like, quote unquote, take pity on these student athletes because they have so much work to do or because they play for such a big team?
Let's see. That's a great question. I do take pity on my students when they get in a hard spot. So like if I have a student who's got a job and comes in and I missed an assignment because I had to work the night shift, I'm sympathetic. And when I get a student who's a football player and has the same kind of sort of story, I'm sympathetic also, because to me it is a job. I will say it's really interesting at the University of Oregon, when you start as a new assistant professor and you're teaching, say, a big economics, introductory economics class, 300 students, the athletic department is keeping track. And if you're sympathetic to the student athletes, next year you'll be teaching a lot more student athletes. If you're not, you won't see them, and they'll find another professor to teach them. And if necessary, they'll go to the sociology department. So there's a lot of shopping around.
Well, let's do another question.
Dave Graff, City Club member. Some allusion was made earlier to large network contacts in response to some big network television agreements made by Eastern conferences. Our local Pac-10, a few years back, reorganized as a Pac-12 in order to bring in Salt Lake City and Denver and support a full-time television broadcasting network. And I'm curious, I haven't heard you speak at all about the impact on the Pac-12 network on our local schools. Certainly, a lot of this issue we're discussing is not so much about athletics, but about the value of the entertainment product generated by these athletic products. And I wonder if you could speak to the impact of the development of the Pac-12 network and its influence on our schools here in Oregon.
Well, I think it's certainly providing more exposure for the schools nationally as an athletic department goes, and it's the way that all these conferences have gone. The Pac-12 was almost the Pac-16 with Texas and Oklahoma, and you're covering half the country at that point. I think you were talking about it earlier. It's more money for the schools in the conference because of that. What was interesting was, I believe when the Pac-12 came out, they had made a promise about a certain amount, and they weren't able to give that certain amount to certain schools. And so for some of the schools that were making plans to build facilities because they thought they were going to get a check for X amount, kind of came in for a lowercase x amount at the end of the year, and they had to put some things on halt. So I think it's that natural divide we talked about. It's either, are you going all in with these conferences that have their networks, or will you kind of stand off by the side? And if you're a school that wants to make that commitment and wants to join, you sort of have to play by those rules now. So I think as far as the impact it'll have, it basically means our local schools that are part of that conference are, in a sense, making a commitment to, we're all in. We're all in to being one of those schools that will be an athletic powerhouse, trying to do everything we can to compete with these other schools.
And to that I would add, whenever these issues come up, my first thought is about the so-called student athletes and the impact there. And as I mentioned earlier, the Pac-12 network means a whole lot more games on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays than there used to be. And even, with football and men's basketball being spread out over more days. And that's more missed class time. It's weird that nobody even talks about missed class time anymore. Even apart from the Pac-12 network, the baseball players at Oregon State miss about 40% of their classes in the spring, and probably, 20% or so in the winter term, just because of their traveling schedule. But the Pac-12 network exacerbated that. When I was a senior at Notre Dame, we went to the Cotton Bowl. It was the first bowl game this was 1969 season, 1970 Cotton Bowl, first bowl game that Notre Dame had gone to since the Four Horsemen in 1925. And the reason why they hadn't gone to bowl games more recently, because bowl games used to be controversial. They took students away from what they were supposed to be doing. We've gone so far beyond that. We don't even talk about missed class time anymore, as if doing something online with your laptop is as valuable as being in Bill Harbaugh's class listening to him lecture. So yeah, that is also a consequence of the Pac-12 network. It's the revenue on the one side, but somebody's got to pay for it, and the people who pay too often are the student athletes.
I think real fast, just on a practical standpoint on that, on TV deals, $6 of your cable bill every month goes directly to ESPN. ESPN uses that money to do things like pay the SEC billions of dollars. There's projected that by next year, the year after, each SEC school could be getting $35 million a year in media rights, which they will use to buy more buildings, which they will use to buy Nick Saban more houses, and then the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and everybody else has to keep up. And so that's the cycle that television and the networks and the money get things on. So let's go out to another question.
Walter Robinson II, City Club member. How does big-time sports affect the rising debt of students and what that's doing to continue to pump pressure into the education bubble?
I would say not so much, honestly. There's a little bit of money involved. At the University of Oregon, we subsidize the athletic department to the tune of maybe $5 million a year. As I mentioned with the student-athlete tutoring, that's directly billed to the tuition of regular students. That's about $2 million a year. But the total tuition revenue for the university is about $380 million. So, that there's some money involved, but it's not huge. Here would be a great story, though. Interestingly, despite how popular college football is, ticket sales for the stadium are not increasing. And so the university is going to bring in about $20 million next year, which is the same as it brought in last year. So revenue's flat for tickets, because everybody's got a big screen TV and ESPN, and they want to watch it on TV at home with their friends instead. So they can't squeeze any more money out of the people going to the games. So what the University Athletic Department did was raise the mandatory fee that they charge students, mandatory fee, or they tried to raise it by 10% so that they could get more money for the students who are buying tickets for the games. So the students made a big deal about that as being an increase in the price of tuition, which it certainly was, but it's $10, right?
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. We're using words like college, university, and student, but where's the role model leadership of someone like Ted Hesburgh, who when he became president of Notre Dame said football is important, but our job is education?
I think when you look at college athletics, the role models have to start with the coaches. These are the men that spend more time with these student athletes every year than they will with their families. And having people of integrity in those positions that can do more than just teach you X's and O's, but teach you more about life and prepare you to be a man or a woman as you get done with school, I think is vital. And I think it's very important also that universities embrace the idea of allowing more of these role models to have a part in the program. It's a very little cost compared to the cost of any time you see negative news or anything that reflects poorly on the university. And so I think it starts at that position. The people that spend the most time with these athletes. I think there's wonderful examples across college sports of some very great coaches that have done a lot for these young men that have helped really change their lives. But I still think it's something we can continue to work on.
I think we got maybe time for one more.
Mark Seeker, City Club member and college football player from Ohio. It was sure a hard place to find a Bucks fan in this town this past season. My question is about evening the benefit to the student population in general that the student athlete population is getting from the success of athletics. Where are the models of better practice in other states or perhaps other countries?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the fact that we're all scratching our heads, suggests that there's not an easy answer to it. There are some places where money has flowed from athletics, and okay. I don't want to be too partisan towards Notre Dame. Father Hesburgh was mentioned. He is a rare figure in higher education. Notre Dame is actually a rare institution in big-time college athletics in that athletics is part of the university. The money, all the money, Notre Dame gets a lot of money. Maybe not as much as we've heard, but it's up there pretty close, top 10 revenue. The money comes into the university, and then a portion of it is allocated to the athletic department. And just as a model, I like that a lot, as opposed to the money comes into the athletic department and then maybe at some places a little bit is gone. But it just provides institutional oversight for athletics that doesn't otherwise exist. So I would say as a kind of a basic model, that's a good one, but I don't imagine it's going to be adopted at Alabama, Auburn, most places anytime soon.
We have run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. As we close, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to Jordan Kent, Dr. William Harbaugh, Dr. Michael Oriard, and our moderator, Ryan White.